Greetings, my name is Marissa Pina, and thank you for tuning into my research proposal for POL 581-7101 Research Methods for Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. This presentation is to briefly describe my research question and why I believe it should be developed and further researched in order to explore the impact of the No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act consequences that impact underperforming schools, specifically focusing on the threat of and actual school closings. As I mentioned previously, I do not plan to keep you long, but would like to give an overview of the No Child Left Behind Act as well as the Every Student Succeeds Act. I will point out and highlight some of the major comparisons and differences between the two. I will briefly review some of the sanctions and consequences that may occur if standards are not met. I also will acknowledge that this subject of standardized testing and closing the achievement gap is very common, and other research has been conducted and journals written that have explored the topic but has significantly neglected to thoroughly examine who is impacted by the consequence of school closures and what effect does this have on those affected in their communities. This brings me to my research question, research design, and conclusion. The No Child Left Behind Act, NCLB, which passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support in 2001 and was signed into law by President George W. Bush on January 8, 2002, is the name for the most recent update to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. The NCLB law, which grew out of concern that the American education system was no longer intentionally competitive, significantly increased the federal role in holding schools responsible for the academic progress of all students. And it put a special focus on ensuring that states and schools boost the performance of certain groups of students, such as English language learners, students in special education, and poor and minority children whose achievement on average trails their peers. States did not have to comply with the new requirements, but if they didn't, they risked losing federal title money. Under the NCLB law, states must test students in reading, math, through grades 3 through 8 once in high school, and they must report the result for both the student population as a whole and for particular subgroups of students, including English learners and students in special education, racial minorities, and children from low-income families. States were required to bring all students to the proficient level on state tests by the 2013-14 school year, although each state got to decide individually just what proficiency should look like and which tests should be used. Under the law, schools are kept on track toward their goals through a mechanism known as Adequate Yearly Progress, or AYP. If a school misses the state's annual achievement targets for 2 years or more, either for all students or for a particular subgroup, it is identified as not making AYP and is subject to a cascade of increasingly serious sanctions. The law also requires states to ensure that teachers are highly qualified, which generally means that they have a bachelor's degree in the subject they are teaching and state certification. Beginning with the 2002-03 school year, all new teachers hired with federal Title I money had to be highly qualified. By the end of the 2005-06 school year, all school paraprofessionals hired with Title I money must have completed at least 2 years of college, obtained an associate's degree or higher, or passed an evaluation to demonstrate knowledge and teaching ability. States are also supposed to ensure that highly qualified teachers are evenly distributed among schools with high concentrations of poverty and wealthier schools. By 2010, it was clear that many schools were not going to meet NCLB's achievement targets. As of that year, 38% of schools were failing to make adequate yearly progress, up from 29% in 2006. In 2011, U.S. Secretary of Education, as part of his campaign to get Congress to rewrite the law, issued dire warnings that 82% of the schools would be labeled failing that year. The numbers didn't turn out to be quite that high, but several states did see failure rates of more than 50%. In Congress, meanwhile, lawmakers saw the need to rewrite, but were unable to bring a bill across the finish line. So that year, the Obama administration offered states a reprieve from many of the law's mandates through a series of waivers. The Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, is a U.S. law passed in December 2015 that governs the United States K-12 program, public education policy. The law replaced its predecessor, the No Child Left Behind Act, NCLB, and modified but did not eliminate provisions relating to periodic standardized testing given to students. Like the No Child Left Behind Act, ESSA is a reauthorization of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which established the federal government's expanded role in public education. The Every Student Succeeds Act passed both chambers of Congress with bipartisan support. The bill is the first to narrow the United States federal government's role in elementary and secondary education since the 1980s. The ESSA retains the hallmark annual standardized testing requirements of the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act, but shifts the law's federal accountability provisions to states. Under the law, students will continue to take annual tests between 3rd and 8th grade. ESSA leaves significantly more control to the state and districts in determining the standards students are held to. States are required to submit their goals and standards and how they plan to achieve them to the U.S. Department of Education, which must then submit additional feedback and eventually approve. In doing so, the DOE still holds states accountable by ensuring they are implementing complement and ambitious yet feasible goals. Students will then be tested each year from 3rd through 8th grade and then once again their junior year of high school. These standardized tests will determine each student's capabilities in the classrooms and the success of the states in implementing its plan. The states are also left to determine the consequences low-performing schools might face and how they will be supported in the following years. The U.S. DOE defines low-performing schools as those in the bottom 10% of the state, based on the number of students who successfully graduate or the number of students who test proficient in reading or language arts and mathematics. Another primary goal of the ESSA is preparing all students regardless of race, income, disability, ethnicity, or proficiency in English for successful college experience and fulfilling careers. Therefore, ESSA also requires schools to offer college and career counseling and advanced placement courses to all students. The Every Student Succeeds Act also sets new mandates on expectations and requirements for students with disabilities. Most students with disabilities will be required to take the same assessments and will be held to the same standards as other students. ESSA allows for only 1% of students, accounting for 10% of students with disabilities, to be excused from the usual standardized testing. This 1% is reserved for students with severe cognitive disabilities who will be required to take an alternative assessment instead. This is a smaller percentage of students than under past mandates, mainly because there is not enough staff available to administer their assessments to the students one-on-one. The Department of Education does not define disabled. Rather, each state decides its own definition in order to determine which students will be allowed to take the alternative assessment. This could prove to be more challenging, though, when it comes to comparing students to one another because not all states will define disabled the same way. The ESSA has also recognized that bullying and harassment in schools affect students with disabilities. Because of this, the ESSA requires states to develop and implement plans on how they will combat and attempt to reduce bullying incidents on their school campuses. Now I'm going to discuss some of the major comparisons and differences between the two acts. The No Child Left Behind Act, its fundamental principle of the bill is that every child can learn. We expect every child to learn, and you must show and prove whether or not every child is learning through testing and accountability. The Every Student Succeeds Act, the new law, tries to preserve the spirit of No Child Left Behind while fixing what were widely perceived as its one-size-fits-all approach. The goal of No Child Left Behind, the predecessor of this law, were right ones, essentially: high standards, accountability, closing the achievement gap. But in practice, it often fell short. It didn't always consider the specific needs of the community. It led it too much on testing during classroom time. It often focused schools on school districts into cookie-cutter reforms that didn't always produce the kinds of results that we wanted to see. The No Child Left Behind Act requires states to test students on math and English every year, the 3rd through 8th grades, and then again once in high school. It also required at least one science test in elementary, middle, and high school. The Every Student Succeeds Act, states must still test students in the same grades, but will now have flexibility in how and when they administer those tests. For example, a single annual assessment can be broken down into a series of smaller tests. There's also an emphasis on finding different kinds of tests that more accurately measure what students are actually learning in the classrooms. No Child Left Behind, one of the biggest fundamental principles of the 2002 law, indeed the principle that gave this law its name, was that schools had to improve the performance of all students. To do that, it requires school districts to break down test scores and other measures for minority subgroups to make sure that they were making progress each year. In practice, many states found that goal to be unrealistic and got around them by either creating super subgroups that lumped all disadvantaged students together or changing to more subjective measures like parent-teacher involvement. The Every Student Succeeds Act, the new law leaves accountability goals almost entirely up to the state instead of at the federal level. States must submit their accountability plans to the Department of Education, which still has a limited oversight role. And there are guardrails defining broadly what the accountability goals needs to include, and test scores and graduation rates must be given much greater weight than the more subjective measures. The No Child Left Behind Act states that wanted their fair share of federal funding were required to fix schools that failed to improve test scores adequately. Those interventions started out with softer measures, but after 5 years, the school had a limited number of dire choices: fire the principal and most of the staff, convert to a charter school, lengthen the school day or year, or close down the school entirely. The Every Student Succeeds Act, the new law, is much more specific about which schools need intervention, but much less specific on what those interventions should be. Schools at the bottom 5% of assessment scores, high schools that graduate less than 67% of students, or schools where subgroups are constantly underperforming would be considered failing and could be subject to state takeover, although the law doesn't say what the state needs to do. Now, not making AYP and is subject, schools can be subject to a cascade of increasingly serious sanctions. A school that misses AYP 2 years in a row has to allow students to transfer to a better performing public school in the same district. If a school misses AYP for 3 years in a row, it must offer free tutoring. Schools that continue to miss achievement targets could face state intervention. States can choose to shut down these schools, turn them over into charter schools, take them over, or use another significant turnaround strategy. What's more, schools that don't make AYP have to set aside a portion of their federal Title I dollars for tutoring and school choices. Schools at the point of having to offer school choice must hold back 10% of their Title I money. Now, after weeks of trying to find support for my own research interests, I soon realized that there has been a ton of research and journal articles written examining the impact of socioeconomic status, race, and standardized test scores, or even the examination at the fact that highly qualified teachers aren't being evenly distributed throughout the education system, or better yet, when schools are not meeting necessary benchmarks, they aren't being transferred to better performing schools. They're often being transferred to the same type of performance schools that they just got kicked out of. The hundreds of thousands of periodicals to support the above theories is tremendous, and that's when I soon realized that there is another perspective that has yet to be examined, which is just as or even more important than those discussed. And that's when I began to focus my attention to one of the particular consequences: school closings. Authorities in cities across the United States are closing public and elementary and high schools at a rapid. In the decade between 2000 and 2010, 6 major U.S. cities closed roughly 200 district schools, including 44 in Chicago, 59 in Detroit, 29 in Kansas City, Missouri, 20 in Milwaukee, 22 in Pittsburgh, and 22 in Washington, D.C. In the year of 2013 alone, Chicago broke the record by closing 49 schools. In the same year, Philadelphia breached another record by shuttering 10% of its public schools, 23 in total. Most of the schools closed have served predominantly African American and Latino students living in low-income neighborhoods. In Boston, it was announced in September of this year that more than 24 schools in Boston with low standardized testing scores are at risk of being declared underperforming by the state, an action that can lead to the removal of principals and teachers and even closings. The 26 schools are spread across nearly every neighborhood from East Boston to West Roxbury. Officials are expected to learn the fate of each school when the state releases the latest round of MCAS data. If the state orders any of the schools to overhaul their programs, they would have 3 years to boost student performance, or they could face a state takeover. 9 of Boston's 125 schools are already designated as underperforming, while 2 others are in receivership, a more dire classification. Now, I have a good friend of mine that is a high school teacher at Madison Park High School in Roxbury, Massachusetts. I also am a product of Boston public school system, so this pretty much affected me tremendously. So that's why I wanted to look into, and I developed the research question: who is disadvantaged and or impacted by school closing? How and why is this happening? The already severely disadvantaged is disadvantaged by school closings. These school district administrators, teachers, students, and parents of these struggling urban communities are impacted once again. But wasn't the No Child Left Behind Act focused was to ensure that states and schools boost the performance of these certain groups? These groups such as English language learners, students in special education, and poor and minority children, whose achievement on average was constantly trailing their peers, and to evenly distribute qualified teachers among these underperforming schools to try to close that achievement gap. And isn't it the Every Student Succeeds Act that was tweaked to also ensure and make clear that the goal is to prepare all students, regardless of race, income, disability, ethnicity, or proficiency in English, for a successful college experience and fulfilled career? And no one has conducted adequate studies and research to explore the impact of these school closings on the population, that same population that these acts was created to protect and to create a fair education system for. That's something that may have you go, that's pretty interesting. As I mentioned previously, there isn't much information on the topic how the already disadvantaged is disadvantaged by these education reform acts, which is pretty ironic. My research design, must refer to the overall strategy that I choose to integrate the different components of the study in a coherent and logical way, thereby ensuring I will effectively address the research problem. It's the blueprint for the collection, measurement, and analysis of data that I would need to adequately answer my research question. And as we know, there are different forms of research. We have basic research, applied research, evaluation research, and action research. There are also two main approaches to a research problem: quantitative and qualitative methods. Quantitative methods are used to examine the relationship between variables, with the primary goal being to analyze and represent that relationship mathematically through statistical analysis. This is the type of research approach most commonly used in scientific research problems. Qualitative methods are chosen when the goal of the research problem is to examine, understand, and describe a phenomenon. These methods are common choice in social science research problems and often used to study ideas, beliefs, human behaviors, and other research questions that do not involve studying the relationship between variables. Once the main approach to the research problem has been determined, there are several research designs for each type of approach that may be considered. So some of the common quantitative designs are correlational, causal, comparative, experimental, quasi-experimental, and some of the common qualitative designs are case studies and historical facts, narratives, grounded theory, and phenomenology. And of course, there's a mixed research design that involves having both a quantitative design and qualitative design. Mixed designs are the best approach as the study requires both quantitative and qualitative designs to address the problem or the statement. And I believe that in my case, I would have to use both quantitative and qualitative designs and eventually develop a mixed design study, even though mixed design studies may take significantly more time, significantly more research, and significantly more money to kind of get everything together. But both acts, to me, I would need experimental. I would have to have some correlation in there, some case studies, and some understanding through phenomenology to actually dig deep and see what actually is taking place with these school closings and the impact that they have on this already disadvantaged group of individuals. In conclusion, understanding who is disadvantaged by these school closings and what impact it has on those impacted would better allow districts, lawmakers, and others who are truly disheartened by these alarming numbers. How can something be created and implemented to create a fair educational experience for all actually be hurting those that need it the most? For this reason alone, adequate research must take has happened and must take place immediately and happen now in order to ensure all children, all race, all backgrounds, all economic statuses have a fair chance in this life. Thank you for listening in, and I look forward to your feedback.